Buying used cars is oftentimes a gamble, but it shouldn't be a mindless gamble. You can go through a process of elimination until the risk becomes acceptable. The older the car, the longer your checklist usually is. 5-year-old cars usually don't suffer from blow-by, and transmissions rarely fail that early. Ultimately, my standards when checking out 20-year-old cars are different from my standards when checking out newer cars. You shouldn't expect a 5-year-old car to have surface rust anywhere in the interior, but that might be a given for a 20-year-old car. You shouldn't expect any oil leaks in a 5-year-old car, but it might be forgivable for a 20-year-old car to have a bit of wetness in the engine bay, as long as it's not too much. So here are some tips that might be useful for you if you're checking out an older European car, or any used car for that matter. The first thing that you'd want to check for is blow-by. If the engine has too much blow-by, that means that either your piston rings or your cylinder walls have too much wear. The first thing I do when checking an engine is I pull out the dipstick and I check if there's oil or smoke coming out of the dipstick hole. In this case, you can see that there's no smoke or oil coming from the dipstick hole. Another thing that you can do is you can open the oil filler cap. Now, depending on the engine, you could either expect oil to come out of the hole, because there are moving parts underneath the hole, of course, so you'd expect oil to be thrown out of it. But in some engines, there's no oil at all, so yeah, check the forums. The one thing that I do is I just put the cap over the hole to check for pressure. If there's pressure underneath the cap, you'd expect it to dance a little bit. And if there's too much pressure, the cap won't stay in place at all. Okay, one tool that would be helpful when checking out a second-hand car is a voltmeter. This one is a very cheap unit that you can plug into your 12-volt socket. Normal reading should be between 12.5 and 14. Anything lower than that, and your battery will discharge as you're driving your car. And if it's over that, your battery will get overcharged and it will get damaged. My reading here is 13.9 with the aircon on. It is 13.4, 13.5. With the lights on, it is at 13.3. So it is. So I have a healthy alternator here. Another thing that you want to check out is the coolant. You don't want it to look frothy, like cappuccino. If it is, that means that you have a head gasket leak. Another method for checking head gasket leaks is let the engine warm up to operating temperature, and then when it reaches operating temperature, try to squeeze one of the radiator hoses. If it's too hard to squeeze, that means that there's excess pressure building up in the cooling system, and you probably have a head gasket leak. Okay, ATF fluid should be reddish in color. If it is too dark or black, or if it smells burned, the transmission could be on its way out. Transmission overhauls are pretty expensive, so unless you know someone who can do it cheaply, or unless you can get a really good discount, I would suggest that you stay away. Check the car's exhaust. It's normal to see if you're just starting the car. It's normal to see a bit of white smoke coming out of it, especially if it rained or if it's moist outside. That's just water vapor in the exhaust system evaporating, but it should disappear as the engine warms up. You should not see black smoke or dark gray smoke. If your car has a vacuum operated central locking system, You can test the health of your vacuum system by checking how long it takes for the door locks to activate. Okay, I'm gonna press it now, listen for the sound, and all the doors are locked now. That is well within the normal range. If it takes more than a second, then you probably have a leak in the system or your vacuum pump is going bad. Ask the seller if he has service records of the car. I have here receipts of all the repairs, or most of the repairs that I've done to the car from 2012 all the way to 2017. If you live in a tropical country like I do, it's very important for a car to have a functioning air conditioning system. Aircon repairs could be either really cheap or really expensive. If the air that's coming out of the vents is not cold, I would suggest that you have someone go inside the car and turn on the aircon while you're in front of the car. Try to listen for a clicking noise in the engine bay. If you don't hear that clicking noise, that could mean that your compressor is not engaging. It could be a wiring issue, or the compressor itself may need to be replaced. One thing to note about some European cars from the mid-90s to the early 2000s is that their blower fans are very hard to access. On the E39 and the X5, you'll have to remove the entire dashboard to replace the blower fan. And that is a pretty expensive and time-consuming job. So I would suggest that you listen to the blower fan if it's making a high-pitched noise. That could mean that the bearings are on their way out. If you can hear that chirping sound, that is the blower motor. Okay, I've bought cars that had terrible looking paint jobs, but after a bit of wet sanding and buffing, they looked good. Usually paint that just looks dull can be wet sanded and buffed. Also, some scratches can be removed by wet sanding and buffing. What I usually do is I just run a fingernail across the scratch, perpendicular to the scratch, and if my fingernail catches on the scratch, that means that it's too deep to buff out. But even if you don't get it completely off, you can minimize it to the point that it's almost unnoticeable from far away. What you want to avoid are paint bubbles, and if the clear coat looks like it's peeling already, that cannot be fixed with buffing. The panel has to be resprayed. If you're buying an older European car, you'd want to buy a car that's being used. It doesn't have to be a daily, as long as it's being used at least once a week. You don't want a car that's been sitting for months or years. Sometimes it's better to buy a car with slightly higher mileage but is being used regularly than a car that's low mileage but has been sitting for years. In an ideal world, you'd want to do a compression test on each of the cylinders, but that will require disassembly of the engine, and most sellers, if not all sellers, will not agree to that. Unless you completely disassemble the car and spend a couple of days driving it, you cannot tell for sure that it's completely problem-free. That's one of the drawbacks of buying a used car from an individual. You have no warranty. One thing that I've learned from buying used cars is that you should always assume that there's something wrong with the car, even if it seems like it's in perfect working condition. And you should always set aside a budget for repairs. What you want to do is you want to eliminate the most expensive repair jobs first, and then work your way down from there.